This is an edited version of the recording of our side event at CND68 at the International Center in Vienna on the 12th of March, because we had some technical difficulties on the day, and we feel that it's very important to get the messages delivered during this side event out into the world. Cannabis in Africa on the centenary of its prohibition, between illegality and opportunity. Cannabis has been part of African cultures for millennia, with its use ranging across a wide variety of traditions and settings. This is despite prohibition associated with colonial rule over the last 100 years. The global conversation surrounding cannabis is evolving rapidly, with many countries reconsidering its legal status, its potential for improving livelihoods, and contemplating a public health approach as an alternative to punitive criminal sanctions. Based on recent on the ground research in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya, this side event explores the African cannabis landscape and heritage and addresses key challenges, opportunities, and potential for policy reform across the continent. I am very pleased to be joined by my esteemed colleagues for this event, and I'd like to introduce you first of all to Professor Tshepo Madlangozi from the South African Human Rights Commission. The professor is joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa today, and will be speaking about the human rights angle and the way that prohibition has affected marginalized and vulnerable communities in South Africa. Thank you, Professor.
No, thank you so much. This is a wonderful event, and we look forward to the deliberation. As Metal said, I am a commissioner at the Human Rights Commission. The South African Human Rights Commission is a national human rights institution created by the Constitution. So we are a constitutional body, independent from the state, but appointed by the president. Our mandate is to monitor and observe the observance of human rights. Now, we are 8 commissioners, and we've divided ourselves into a number of portfolios. My portfolios are threefold. I oversee equality, anti-racism, justice in the whole of South Africa. So the National Commissioner overseeing equality, justice, and anti-racism. As part of our activities for the past financial year and the next financial year, we had decided to put a lot of focus on the treatment of Rastafari people. The reason why we did that is that we received a number of complaints from Rastafari people that despite our very good constitution, despite our good policies that allows freedom of expression, that allows freedom of association, that allows freedom of religion, and that upholds dignity and equality. Despite this very good constitution, members of this community continue to be marginalized, discriminated, and even criminalized. And of course, the main entry point into their marginalization, their criminalization, and their persecution is cannabis, is really about cannabis. And here, the starting point is that South Africa has made a lot of headway in the regulation of cannabis. In 2008, there was a very good court case in which the Constitutional Court, our highest court, decided that the private use of cannabis by adults will be decriminalized. The private use, cultivation of cannabis by adult users will be decriminalized. That was followed by a piece of legislation, an act in 2024, a day before the elections, our general elections, which confirmed that adult users of cannabis, Rastafari or otherwise, can use, possess, and cultivate cannabis. The Human Rights Commission was heavily involved in the monitoring of the passing of this act, because our view as the national human rights institution is that cannabis should not be criminalized. The first starting point is that cannabis has a long-standing history in our communities in South Africa. Indigenous communities use it as medicine. They use it in their cultural rituals. They use it in their rituals. But secondly, a lot of communities have used cannabis for economic sustenance. And then thirdly, of course, the Rastafari community from the 1960s has been a key component of this community. We find no use in criminalizing cannabis. We find no substantive policy, public policy need to regulate cannabis. The research that we have undertaken has shown us that, number one, despite these two historical developments, the Constitutional Court judgment, which is our highest court, as well as a national legislation effectively decriminalizing cannabis, unlawful arrests continue. Unlawful arrests continue. We can give you some statistics as confirmed by the police. So, for example, I can give you just 2 years. 2022 to 2023, 19,000 people were arrested for possession of cannabis. 19,000 people. Out of those, 16,000 cases were withdrawn. So about 19,000 arrested, but 16,000 cases withdrawn. 2023-2024 year, arrested people 16,841, withdrawn 14,000. So if you look at these statistics, you see that we still have a high rates of arrest of cannabis users. But most importantly, by the police own admission, almost over 75% of the cases are simply withdrawn. And I really want you to stay with that statistics. Almost 75,000 cases are withdrawn. So what happens is that people are arrested, they're taken to the police station, they're held overnight, they're held over the weekend, and they're simply released. Or they are arrested, put into detention, then later on they're called to court and the case is simply withdrawn. It is unnecessary. It is not effective policing. But most importantly, from the Human Rights Commission perspective, it continues the history of racism, of profiling, of people with dreadlocks, people who look like Rastafarians. So there's a huge issue to do with profiling, which, as the court said, it is replete with racism. Secondly, police come into people's properties, they search their houses without search warrants sometimes, violating their right to privacy. Thirdly, people are stopped and they're searched in front of their children, which is very humiliating. But most importantly, we find that the way cannabis continues to be regulated can amount to systemic violation and systemic discrimination. Therefore, On this centenary year of the prohibition of cannabis internationally, as a Human Rights Commission, we will continue to do our best to engage with the police, to engage with the lawmakers, to make sure that at the minimum, the arrest of cannabis users ends. That's the first thing. The unlawful arrest must stop. Secondly, we are advocating for a fair system of commercialization, the trading in cannabis. You can't, on the one hand, say adults can consume, cultivate, and possess cannabis. But on the other hand, you don't say how they should be able to access that. So commercialization of cannabis becomes very, very important. So I know I only had 10 minutes, so I'll stop here. We really want to support and salute Fields of Green for All, that for a number of years, they've been very, very much involved in the campaign to decriminalize cannabis, the campaign to educate cannabis users of their rights. In South Africa, we talk about the Dagga couple, the famous Dagga couple. And really, I want to use this opportunity to sincerely, salute Merkel and her partner for the work that they've done. They were heavily involved in the court case that led to the decriminalization, that eventually led to the legislation. We will continue to collaborate with Fields of Green for All, continue to collaborate with all our stakeholders, and really learn from best practices elsewhere in the world, as well as in Africa, where they've really done a lot to decriminalize cannabis and to really bring this unlawful arrest and the discrimination, the marginalization, and the criminalization of cannabis users to end. The last thing that I will say is that as South Africa, we take a huge responsibility because we know it was our Prime Minister Jan Smuts, asked the League of Nations to prohibit cannabis, and that was done in 1925. So we take huge responsibilities to collaborate with our partners that not only in South Africa, but internationally, we treat cannabis users with respect and dignity. Thank you so much, Michael. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Professor. So lovely to see you, and maybe we can have you here in person next year at CND. Our next speaker is friend and colleague Gernot Klanschnig. He will give us a little quick overview, unless Maria, you want to go first? Are you okay?
You go first. That's fine.
Okay, so unfortunately Maria needs to leave, so we're going to change the order just a little bit. Maria Goretti-Ane is a lawyer, a consultant, and a drug policy advocate specializing in human rights, dedicated to promoting justice and evidence-based approaches to drug policies. Maria is committed to creating a fair and equitable society through her impactful work at the International Drug Policy Consortium. Maria, thank you so much for joining us today. I neglected to say that Maria is from Ghana, and Ghana was one of the subjects of our research, together with the rest of West Africa. And if Maria can give us a quick overview of what's going on with cannabis in Ghana.
All right, thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for the organizers. It's indeed a privilege to be here to share what we have been doing in Ghana for some time now. If you all remember, in 2020, we passed a new law, Act 1019, that sought to introduce an element on cannabis cultivation for medicinal and industrial purpose. Unfortunately, it was shut down by the Supreme Court in 2020 because of procedural issues, that the Constitution allows certain processes to be taken in terms of such introduction of such policy direction. but it was reintroduced by the minister in 2023, and it went through and it passed. Last year, we managed to get the legislative instrument that will help operationalize the cultivation of cannabis for medicinal and industrial purpose. I would want to say that, in fact, the discussions around moving that direction as a country was actually motivated based on health, human rights of people who use drugs, as well as social justice. Because a lot of the discussions on the floor of parliament was that we have a lot of local cultivators who are criminalized, and we need to look at the livelihoods that, these crop that people depend on for livelihood. And so it was important for us to see how we can regulate this to be able to address the challenges on the ground. So that was one of the motivations. And also the fact that there have been global conversations, and of course there's enough evidence to point to the fact that cannabis and its other parts can be used for industrial purpose. So the country wanted to explore this aspect of the cultivation. Now, of course, as a baby country that is beginning to look at these things, definitely there are challenges. And some of the challenges are that there is that fear from the community of especially local farmers, that this whole beautiful thing that has been thought of by our parliamentarians is likely to be captured. There's kind of like corporate capture, because the likelihood that they will be left out in this whole process is very high. Because if you look at the conversation in Africa, most of the time around cannabis, it's more about the economies and the monies that we are going to drive from all these things, neglecting the people on the ground who are being sustained by these plants, and they have been doing this for years. So we have been, as civil society, we have been engaging with Parliament as well as other stakeholders and the cannabis farmers to see how we can actually bridge this gap in terms of bringing them to that space to be able to also fall part of the legitimate market and not left out. Because, of course, if they are left out, the solutions we are looking for in addressing illegal cultivation is still going to be enormous. Because if they are driven down there and they are not brought onto the space to be part of the legitimate market, of course, we'll still have illicit markets going on, and we will not be able to address the challenges that are happening. So, of course, having looked back as a country to look at how prohibition is negatively impacting our society, is impacting these farmers who are depending on this crop, we thought it wise to move in that direction and to be able to put in place this legislation to address most of these challenges. We haven't done much as a country, since the passage, because of the constitutional issues that arose after the law was passed. It has really kind of given a lot of setbacks in terms of progress made so far. But I can assure you that now the legislative instrument, which is supposed to help us progress in terms of operationalization, the license and all that, has now been put in place, and we are very hopeful that that will move on. Now, just to share a few experience in terms of all these discussions that happen in Ghana and what we can all learn from it. For me, in person, as an activist, I have learned that this whole discussion doesn't, it needs to be broadened. You need to bring everybody on the table for us to have a meaningful conversation around this and address the issues. You have to respect the various views from all spectrum so that you can make meaningful decisions around this. And of course, we know this is a journey that is very long. You have to pursue it. You have to be consistent. You have to engage widely to make sure that that's what happens. Because as a country, if we hadn't been able to engage with all the two divides of the political parties, as well as the local grassroots, the religious leaders, and all the people, I don't think we would have been able to. We all know the perspective in Africa concerning cannabis. And of course, as a country, we are beginning to make these strides. And I believe that it was an opportunity to share this and to encourage many other countries who are also looking forward in that direction. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm really grateful.
Great. I'm sure that that everybody, if you want some more information about what is going on in Ghana, you can always contact Maria through us. So thank you very much, Maria. I'm sorry that you can't stay for the rest of the event, but we do understand that you're being pulled in all sorts of directions at the CND.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is my friend and colleague, Gernot Klanschnik, Gernot is the professor in the School of Policy Studies at the University of Bristol and principal investigator of a UK Research Council funded project called Cannabis Africana, Drugs and Development in Africa. His research focuses on the critical study of drugs and drug policy, especially in West Africa, from historical and contemporary perspectives. Gernot is going to give us an overview of the last 4 years of work with our Cannabis Africana project. Thank you, Gernot.
Thank you very much, Myrtle, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And just at the very beginning, I want to thank Fields of Green for All and Myrtle for putting this together, because it's a lot of effort to bring all those people from all over the world together in Vienna. So we really appreciate that. And for us as researchers, it's very important because we live in our bubbles sometimes, and it's good to get out of it. And I'm happy to talk to anyone afterwards to tell us how we can improve this kind of working in silos, which we sadly sometimes do. So what I want to do today is very briefly present the project that we have been running, which is called Cannabis Africana, Drugs and Development in Africa, which I will just outline, and then my colleagues will go into the different country case studies to give us more of a sort of idea what's happening. And actually what Maria said sort of links very much, because we are also working with colleagues in Ghana to some degree on this project. I think next slide. Okay, so the project, just as a background, this is a standard type of research project which lasted for 4 years, from 2020 to 2024, funded by the main sort of funding body for research, independent research in the UK, the Economic and Social Research Council. So it's not linked to any business interests. It's important to state that. I think it's not linked to any governmental interests. So we are just doing independent research. And the kind of question that this project was interested in from the very beginning is what the historical and contemporary role of cannabis is in African rural and urban lives, actually. And we kind of intentionally stress the historical element. And I know for many people here, the history is very important as well, because we feel in the drug policy field or in the field of cannabis policy, there's often this concern with very contemporary issues, the latest drug scare of fat, but without understanding that there is a long history to those issues that we need to understand to deal with them in the contemporary world, for example. So our project looked at that. It also looked at livelihoods, something that Maria already touched on. Rather than looking at cannabis as a drug, we really wanted to see what role it plays in people's lives, in people's livelihoods. And as a contrast as well, our research is slightly different from the research you might have heard in other panels. I think I went to one yesterday afternoon where this was all about statistics, scale. Our project is a qualitative study. So we are interested to hear from the people that are actually involved in the legal or illegal markets for cannabis and what they think cannabis means to them and what role it plays in their lives. Basically, it's quite different. It's interview-based, ethnographic in a way, and small scale. So we are not intending to say something about the scale, but we want to sort of make sure that the voices of the people that we talk to are heard in those kind of forums. And to be honest, this project wasn't really a policy-oriented project, and these policy briefs that I've passed around, or that we have passed around, they probably are much better at describing what I can do in these short minutes, but we didn't plan for those. But partly because cannabis is such a hot policy topic, we sort of got pulled into those debates, and we actually quite enjoyed working with many of the partners listed here, like the IDPC, West African Drug Policy Foundation, Fields of Green for All, that taught us how to make our work in a way work better. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of an illustration. As I said, this is a very sort of very broad brush type of illustration. If you look at the map of the continent, it's very diverse. Things, even in countries that I study, Nigeria, are different in different parts of the country. But you see that when we started our project, the whole continent was actually red and was dominated by prohibitionist or totally prohibitionist approaches to drugs, and including cannabis. But over the last few years, this has changed. And so our project does look at countries like Nigeria and Kenya that have stuck to the prohibitionist kind of approach, which means a very repressive approach, especially in the Nigerian case, to cannabis and other substances. But we also have countries like Zimbabwe that Clemens will talk about, and South Africa that Simon will talk about, that have started to reform their policies and rethink their policies on cannabis by either introducing sort of the legal cultivation for industrial purposes of hemp, or the legal cultivation for medicinal purposes, which you have in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. And in South Africa, as we heard in the first presentation, also the decriminalized sort of the private use of cannabis. So we had these 4 countries that actually look very different at cannabis nowadays. So it was a kind of nice comparison to look at those 4 countries, and we hear about these countries in a second. But I think one thing that's important to mention is that while we have a lot of debate about cannabis policy reforms, much more than when I started studying this almost 20 years ago, and we have legal markets now, I think in most countries we still have a very prohibitionist kind of approach that dominates, including the countries that are in these colorful, that are more colorful now, basically, that have introduced reforms. That's something to keep in mind, that I think the thinking, prohibitionist thinking, is still very dominant. Next slide, please. So what I want to do now, this is mostly based on my kind of research on Nigeria. So in Nigeria, cannabis is illegal, heavily punished. Many years of prison if you get caught cultivating it, trading it, as well as possessing and using it. But what we found, not just in Nigeria, but also in other parts of the continent, that cannabis has a very long history, is very deep-rooted in terms of its socio-cultural and economic roots, for example. Sometimes in the literature that's overlooked because it doesn't look at the history, as I said. But I think policymakers need to understand that kind of significance. Cannabis, especially in Nigeria, where it's a booming business, to be honest, it's an illicit but booming business, provides a very important source of livelihoods for farmers, but not just for farmers that grow it, but also for traders and retailers. And what it does for most people, even though you might hear that this is a very organized criminal activity, for most of the farmers that we have interacted with, it just provides a means to cover some of their basic needs, be it the education of their children, be it the care of their elders, or just getting by on a daily basis. So it's a livelihood for the economically marginalized in rural economies and also in urban economies. And in some places where we have studied it, it actually has names that go with that. It's called the leaf lifting the poor, for example, in one area of southwestern Nigeria that we studied. So it plays that kind of role. Not for everyone. There's a bit of larger scale cannabis as well. We don't want to ignore that or sort of deny it, but largely it's a livelihood for the marginalized, really. And one thing I think we need to be honest about as well is that cannabis illicit is not perfect. In Nigeria, it creates a lot of risk for the people involved. There's violence, and that stems usually from the state. So the most violent actor in this whole equation is the state that cracks down on cultivators by eradicating their farms and surrounding areas, as well as the other people that are involved in the market. And obviously, it's a very stigmatized type of business. So it's not perfect, but for the marginalized, it does help them quite significantly. Last slide. So I know this is the UN, and so in our policy brief, we have these recommendations, which as academics, we don't usually like to do, but we have to do. So here they are, maybe a bit broad, but so what we thought, and you can read much more detail about it in the brief, but policymakers essentially need to obviously reevaluate the prohibitionist approach, which is completely ineffective. In the case of Nigeria, the best estimates we have is that about 10% of the population is using cannabis after decades of a very, very repressive approach. Nigeria is a big country. That's 220 million. That's 22 million approximately of past year cannabis users. So this is obviously a large proportion of the population. And supposedly the policy has addressed that, but it hasn't really. So cannabis is very widespread. The prohibitionist policy also perpetuates marginalization of people that are already very marginalized anyway, as I said. So people are even put further to the margins, and it perpetuates violence. Sort of, it gives agencies, law enforcement agencies, a sort of green pass to do whatever they want to in rural communities, especially, but also in urban. And it encourages corruption, which is kind of part of this, of the whole system of how it works at the moment. What I think policymakers also need to understand is that there's a very important local significance to cannabis. This is used not just for recreational reasons. There's nothing wrong with recreational reasons or pleasure, but it's also used for work purposes. It's used for medicinal purposes, and it has a long history for those reasons, for these types of uses as well. And often policymakers do not understand these kind of significances. And I think one thing that links to Maria's point, where we have seen policy reform in some of our countries, it has often come from a very top-down dimension, and then it doesn't really resonate with the people on the ground that we study with, you know, because they're not part of the equations. Call them legacy farmers or whatever you might call them. But in the cases where it seems to work a bit better, actually in the Ghanaian case, it's an interesting one. I think it's when the process is a bit more inclusive, when it has started to include the farmers that were formerly criminalized, and where it has actually been messy. I know not everyone might agree with me on that, maybe the South Africans neither, but I think sometimes policy process need to be messy to make sense, to be inclusive, because it can't just work based on a template that you take from abroad. And I think in many African countries, what we have found is that often policymakers look to North Africa, they look to Europe for examples or models, but I think there is quite a lot of good examples on the continent, in the continent now, that I think we would advise African policymakers to look to learn and to implement policy that's more sustainable and better. I think I'll leave it at this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gernot. Thank you so much, Gernot. We might run out of time, but I'm not going to waste any time in introducing Neil Carrier. Is an associate professor in social anthropology at the University of Bristol, with expertise and research interest in a range of fields, including the anthropology of drugs, which includes the ethnography of East Africa. So we go from the West, Ghana and Nigeria, over to the East, and Neil's research on the pat plant has been widely publicized as a little side note there. Thank you, Neil and Kenya.
Oh, thank you, Myrtle. And yeah, just to thank, like as Gernot did, to thank Myrtle for all the organisational skills and getting us here to hear at the Vienna at the CND. It's yeah, wonderful effort on your part as always, Myrtle, and your team. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to give a little shout out to our colleagues who have worked with me on the Kenyan side of things. So in this research project, I've been the co-investigator alongside Gernot of this Cannabis Africana project. But my focus has mainly been on the East African side, and Kenya in particular is where I've been doing my work. And I just wanted to give a shout out to my colleagues, Bernice Pondi, who's some of you may know, who's done wonderful work in the field of drugs and other work in sort of human rights and social justice in Kenya for a long time, and has been a colleague of us on this, been very helpful in this project. And also our colleague Gordon Amenya, a Kenyan scholar who's worked quite a lot with me on the research in Kenya for this project. So as Myrtle was saying, and I'll try and be very quick in this just to give our other colleagues a bit of time, but as Myrtle was saying, I'm an anthropologist, so most of my work has been ethnographic, you know, in focus. My main methodology is, you know, kind of using an ethnographic, very qualitative approaches to the work, looking at sort of livelihoods and cannabis and consumption and other aspects of cannabis in Kenya. But another aspect that, like the whole project as a whole, we really have tried, as Gernot was saying, to have this very historical approach that we've incorporated. because a lot of the patterns and dynamics within each of the countries we've been working with, these aren't recent dynamics. They're things that do have this very long history that we've been trying to track down. So through a lot of archival research and oral histories and we've been trying to get a picture of the longer history. And somewhere like Kenya really is interesting because the cannabis use, it does go back a long, long way, to those sort of, 1,000 years, maybe more, those sort of Western Indian Ocean networks that no doubt brought cannabis originally to East Africa. So we've really tried to put it into this historical perspective, especially in Western Kenya, the part of Kenya where I've mainly worked, which really does have a long history of the use of cannabis, but goes back way before Prohibition came in. So this is really important context. And it's quite interesting to look at the history of Prohibition as it was brought in. And this is very much a colonial story as well, which Gernot and I and our colleagues have been tracing too, how a lot of this is a very colonial story of when these laws originally were imposed in countries like Kenya. And this is something that people very much use in the present day. This kind of history, it's a living history because quite a lot of the activists who are trying to change Kenyan cannabis law. So Kenya, one of the countries like Nigeria, where it remains illegal, but quite a lot of activists use this fact that a lot of these laws were originally colonial ones, as kind of ammunition to try and argue that, these laws should be changed, pointing to, the colonial past of these laws. So really important history that we've been trying to bring up. And it's so the history of Prohibition in Kenya actually goes back even further than 100 years to sort of 1914, when really concerted efforts were put in place. So quite a long history of Prohibition in Kenya. But despite this, consumption is just still such a vibrant thing. It's, consumed by not just, it's consumed by people from all parts of society within Kenya. So very, very widespread item of consumption. And this is despite Prohibition, So in those kind of terms, you can see how ineffectual Prohibition has been over the years. As, it still is an item of consumption that remains ever so popular. And as a consequence of this having so much demand, and also as a consequence of these prohibitionist laws, there's a real vibrant trade in cannabis as well, because partly the value for a lot of the people involved in cannabis trade in Kenya, a lot of the value that they get from that crop is partly a function of the fact that it is prohibited. This is a thing that has given something that is quite easy for people to grow, but has given it that value as a commodity that people are trading, and gives it that value. And also has made it a key resource. So in terms of livelihoods, Kenya's, we found, is not so much of a producer country these days. It mostly imports its cannabis. But still, there's a lot of people, like Gernot was saying, kind of on the margins of society who derive value from it. And, it's a resource for people living quite hard lives. Cannabis can give them those kind of resources to survive. So there's all these aspects that we've been looking at in terms of livelihoods. But one thing I just wanted to bring up before I hand over to my colleagues for other countries is something that does run through very different case studies, but how cannabis is also such a resource for the police as well in these countries. Because so many of the traders we met in Kenya and other countries, they're all very, very much known to the police and, have relationships with the police where they pay sums and all this kind of thing. And it's, something that's very, very well known in Kenya as well. But, the fact that it is a key resource for police officers as well, and other, members of the state as well. So this is a key aspect that we've been pulling out. And in Kenya, there's a lot of debate trying to push for change. So even though change hasn't yet come to the laws, there is a lot more of a movement to bring change, and a lot more debate these days. But I think, just to echo what Gernot was saying about the project as a whole, I think in terms of Kenya, what we're trying to do is really kind of push for these sort of voices of these urban traders and others that we've been speaking to in Kenya, really to get those voices heard in, you know, as Kenya maybe moves towards looking at what alternatives there may be to the current prohibitionist models. And again, sort of learning from other African countries and, you know, all the work that's been done in South Africa, in Ghana and elsewhere, in, you know, how Kenya might plan to push ahead, if it does, you know, move to a different way of tackling cannabis. So, to leave time to my colleagues, I'll leave it there with that little snapshot of Kenya, the work we've been doing in Kenya. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. So we've whizzed from the west to the east, and now we're going to move just slightly down south to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Clemens Rusenga, who is from Zimbabwe, just north of South Africa. Dr. Rusenga, formerly at the University of Bristol, but now with the Department of Social Studies at Cardiff University, hails from Zimbabwe, and his research and interests cover land and agrarian studies. And that is something that is very close to our hearts in Africa. The issues of land, the issues of access to land, and the issues of the utilization of the land. Very, very important thing that's at the heart of what we do in cannabis activism. His research is mainly in Southern Africa and is the nexus between, and also researches the nexus between drugs and development in Africa and that very, very important issue of livelihoods. Clemens, over to you online.
Thank you so much. As Meto has highlighted, I also worked with my colleagues, Genot, Neil, Simon, and the others. So regarding including Meto and Maria on this project, but I was focusing more on Zimbabwe. So I will just use a few minutes because my colleague Simon, he needs to be attending to his class in a few minutes as well. So I'll just highlight a little bit on cannabis policy reforms in Zimbabwe. So for a long time, for many years, cannabis was classified as a dangerous drug under the Dangerous Drugs Act, Chapter 15.02 as amended. But to cut the story short, in 2018, the government legalized the production of cannabis for medicinal and industrial purposes. So industrial purposes mainly covering hemp, its use in the form of hemp. But what that legalization did is that it created a dichotomous market where all unlicensed production and the trade and the use remained illegal, and only those which were and only licensed production covered those who were producing for medicinal and industrial purposes. So I'll just move quickly to some of the findings that emerged, and this relates also to the findings that my colleagues New and Genot have already alluded, even Maria as well, that in Zimbabwe as well, you find that cannabis remains a means of livelihood for many local people amidst economic hardship and declining living standards. So you find that in some areas, it is the main source of income, and with the income also reinvested in illegal activities, such as food production and paying for children's school fees. So what we see is that it remains very important. But also on the legal side, we find that the current policy reforms in the way they have been implemented and the way they have fared so far, that they are having limited economic benefits for the license holders. And here I'm now talking about those who are licensed, that there's limited economic benefits for them because the production regime is very costly, and many of the licensed producers are also struggling with the access to markets, but also tough economic challenges within the country, which affect everyone, whether it's industry. If you are following developments in Zimbabwe, then you will be familiar with what is happening there. So in 2023, from the reports from the government agencies, so for example, in the medicinal sector, about 5 out of 60 producing, 60 licensed producers, they were producing in 2023. And the first commercial export to Europe was in 2023. But we are talking of licenses that began in 2019. But by 2023, we only had 5 who were producing, and some of them producing for research and development purposes, not even maybe enough good quality for them to export to Europe, because there's no domestic markets. You can only produce for export. So, for example, with the hemp as well, about from the 2023. So you find that about 485 kgs CBD flower exported to Europe in 2022 to 2023 season by 3 growers, and about 1 ton supplied to local market by 1 grower. So all this, and we are talking about again over 50, about 60 something licensed herbal producers, and only very few being able to produce. So we can see that the impact, the contribution of the new legal market also on the farmers themselves is limited, with some of them actually divesting, or even if you check government reports, there's a few who have surrendered their licenses. So there's also limited contribution to the national economy, linked to the point that I just highlighted earlier on. So because the few farmers are able to produce or export, because of they're facing market challenges, struggling to find markets because they can only produce for external markets, where there's no domestic market. But even though now the government is exploring, trying to find ways to create a domestic market where medicinal cannabis could be part of the public health delivery system. Then we also find that, for example, in 2023, 2 agribusinesses were producing 1 ton of CBD oil per month for export. So we can just anticipate that over time things might improve, but the production system, given that, for example, you need to set up, it's very costly to set up a legal cannabis business in Zimbabwe, especially on the medicinal one, with the experts suggesting that it could take up to, say, 100,000, even 1 million to set up if you want to put everything for 1 hectare, because you need also to have CCTV to be grown in greenhouses, and most of the inputs also are imported. So all those are adding to the exports, making the new cannabis market very exclusive. But what we see also is that cannabis legalization is not benefiting illicit small-scale producers, but it is aimed at attracting foreign and local investment. So you could see also there even the license fees of about $50,000 for medicinal and 200 for hemp, which are very limited, which are very likely to be you will find that small scale illicit producers, they do not have such kind of money. But that ban on non-medicinal cannabis uses, and locally, but also the legal sector's focus on export markets, has helped to preserve the domestic illicit market. So there's less competition from legal cannabis from the legal sector, which has created a space that enabled livelihoods for small-scale producers. Just the last slide and the last few points for policy implications, I think we need to rethink prohibition, although it affects the scale of illicit cannabis production in Zimbabwe. that it has been ineffective. It has been ineffective in curbing production and trade. There's also need to engage all stakeholders, including illicit producers, to ensure inclusivity of cannabis policy reforms. The local significance of cannabis should be taken into consideration when reforming policies to ensure that the needs of all different stakeholders are accommodated. There's also need to review the costly legal production models to enhance production efficiency. And I think here, homegrown solutions are important rather than copying from other parts of the world, especially in the global north. And the entry barriers, for example, high license fees, they create risks for corporate capture because they leave now only those with the resources being able to be part of that market, excluding the majority who cannot afford such. Thank you so much, Meto. I want to leave a few minutes for my colleague.
Thank you very much, Clemens. And we'll just rush over to Simon in Cape Town. We've now hit the very southern tip of our beautiful continent after our little technical glitchy whiz around Africa. Dr. Simon Howell is a lecturer and senior research associate at the Centre of Criminology, the Faculty of Law in the University of Cape Town. Simon was also our expert for the trial of the plant in 2017, our expert in criminology. He works closely with us at Fields of Green for All with our campaign of Stop the Cops. Simon has taken the data that we've collected over the years, and he has put this into a few maps, and in about 5 minutes, Simon's going to tell us about what this data is telling us about policing cannabis in South Africa. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Myrtle. So I'm sorry, I have to teach in about 3 minutes, so I'm going to be very brief.
That's fine.
Just to talk about South Africa, I think I want to echo what the Commissioner said, in that cannabis remains deeply embedded within a number of socio-cultural configurations. And, it's not something, it has a very long history in the country. And while legal reform has created the possibility for thinking differently and doing differently in terms of cannabis regulation and increases in agricultural output and the like, chiefly this has been undermined by a lot of procedural concerns and sort of practical considerations around how to regulate cannabis beyond prohibition. And I think, that is for me the key finding that of the project, and what we've spoken about a lot is that it's one thing to end or want to ask to end prohibition, but it's another to regulate substances beyond the prohibitionist framework. And I think South Africa has muddled its way through and is continuing to muddle its way through these issues, especially around policing and the like. For instance, the police don't really know what to do or how to police beyond prohibitionist framework. So it's a learning curve for everyone. And I think we are in the midst of that learning curve. If I'm just going to skip straight to the last slide. If you have a look at the map that I hope everyone can see, that map represents the arrests per police precinct across the whole of the country. And as you see, there is quite a significant amount of arrests. I mean, as the Commissioner said, cannabis arrests continue to proliferate despite the change in the law, and despite the fact that the cannabis arrests, over 75% of the arrests lead to absolutely nothing. They don't lead to convictions or even to court. They simply, people are arrested and then they go the next day. And as a result, the question needs to be asked, well, is this a good use of policing time, for instance, and is it a good use of regulatory time? And I think the lesson there is that in changing the law, we also need to change the procedures that occupy people's lives and occupy governments' lives, so as that a new framework is more substantive and not simply based at a legal level. In this instance, we've also tracked out what Myrtle spoke about, the Stop the Cops data. In other words, the hotline that people phone when they have been arrested for cannabis crimes, as they are put, or simply spuriously arrested. And as you see, there was a lot of on that map. There's a lot of issues in urban areas, and I think that also relates to our concern around privacy, in the sense that the Cannabis Bill, or the Cannabis Act, regulates cannabis use according to the concept of private spaces, but the concept of private spaces is not really applicable in the township context of South Africa, in which, you know, there is no neatly defined borders between properties and the like. So it's these contextual concerns that ultimately need to be considered, I think, and from a policy recommendation perspective, it's understanding that, you know, there's no one-size-fits-all policy perspective that can be applied to cannabis regulation in each country. I think across the continent, each country is different and each will require a different response. But in the South African instance, one of the key findings is that we need to consider the context in which cannabis is used, distributed, and produced, to come up with laws and frameworks that are more not only responsive to people's concerns, but also more effective at actually procedurally dealing with cannabis and dealing with cannabis as an economic asset rather than something that ought to be that is, at least in the last 50 years, being pursued and hounded out of the country. So it's that perspective that I think that is important and that we need to consider more deeply in policy discussions. With that, sorry, I need to run. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to everybody who's joined us in the room today. Sorry about the technical glitches, but an edited version of this whole presentation with all the slides will be on our YouTube channel, so please follow us on social media. You can sign up for our newsletter that comes out once a week via our website, fieldsofgreenforall.org.za. And just lastly, but certainly not least, I would like to really thank our co-sponsors of this event, the Cannabis Embassy, Her Many Voices, for their incredible generosity in helping us with our travel expenses to get to Vienna, Cannabis Africana and the University of Bristol, the South African Cannabis and Hemp Industry Development Association, the Human Rights Commission, the Forum Drugs Mediterranean, Veterans Action Council, ICEAS, SSDP, Transform Drug Policy, NCOD, the Traditional and Natural Health Alliance in South Africa, and last but not least, the Umzimvubu Farmers Support Network. So thank you very much for joining us today, and please look out for the full video with all of the presentations on our YouTube channel, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.